This is a story of long ago.
So starts one of the most famous books ever written. We tell how it really happened in a land in the middle called Birmingham, with its markets and factories that was known far and wide for its bounties of industry and enterprise, yet peaceful and prosperous. In a hole in the ground, there lived the Hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with ends of worms and oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. We start our journey of JRR Tolkien here, in the middle of England, well, Sarehole Mill to be more precise. In Tolkien's time, 120 years ago, this mill was in a suburb of Birmingham that did not look this way. It was a hamlet in Worcestershire, surrounded by trees, which would have looked a bit more like this. There are very few places within Britain that don't lay claim to being part of Middle-earth. In all fairness, who wouldn't want to be part of Tolkien's universe? What I'm going to show you is how Tolkien built his world from his surroundings, so you can do the same. Or you can just sit back and enjoy some lovely shots of the British countryside. To start, Tolkien's early years were not easy. He was born John Ronald Reuel in South Africa in 1892, being the eldest son of a bank manager. He returned to England, specifically Birmingham, aged 3 with his mother and younger brother Hilary. His father died of rheumatic fever the following year, leaving his widow Mabel with no income and 2 young children. Mabel moved to Sarehole Mill and home-tutored her boys in not just the basics, but instilled in Ronald a love of art, nature, language, and, above all else, literature. She would take her boys into the imagery contained in the magical world of Beowulf, with its kings, monsters, and dragons.
Hail, we have heard tales sung of the Speardanes, the glory of their war kings in days gone by, how princely nobles performed heroes' deeds, of Sealed Seeping, who captured the mead halls from many peoples, from troops of enemies, terrifying their chieftains. Though he was first a poor foundling, he lived to find comfort. Under the heavens he flourished, with honours fulfilled. To each neighbouring nation, those of the Well Road, bowed under his rule and paid the price of tribute. He was a good king.
Tolkien's playground was Moseley Bog near the mill in this little hamlet, where you could imagine the trees looming over him, just like the creatures described to him. The local area where he had his adventures were in the rolling hills of Shropshire and Worcestershire, whilst his aunt lived in Bag End, a name he would later put to good use. Tolkien loved exploring, and he was fascinated by Celtic mythology. En route to Snowdonia, the ancient kingdom of Gwynedd to the west, he would have travelled along the old road through Church Stretton, which is a small town in Shropshire, they say a little Switzerland for the people of the Midlands. Nearby are the picturesque cottages of the Cardingmill Valley, which had the hills of Longmin towering over, giving him his visions of Rivendale, the Elven Tower, and House of Elrond. It was described as the last homely house east of the sea, and the landscape still gives the sense of awe that Tolkien must have had, either below in the valley or above, overlooking the beautiful Shire. It is from this point that Tolkien first created everything we know about fantasy today. If you imagine an orc or an elf, what you're imagining is most likely that conjured by Tolkien. Everything from Dungeons and Dragons to epic high adventures, were that created by Tolkien himself. He was the first geek. Yes, there have been other writers before him, but he was the first to create something so huge that he took his readers into multiple lands. In fact, he was one of the first high fantasy writers. When Tolkien was 8, his mother converted the family to Catholicism. She awarded a priest at the oratory guardianship of her sons should anything happen to her. Came it did, and she died of diabetes when Ronald was only 12. Tolkien was luckily looked after, and his education could continue. Like Sarehole Mill, the oratory would play a significant part in the fantasy world that Tolkien would later take us to. From his window at the oratory there were 2 towers of Perrott's Folly and Edgbaston Waterworks, behind which, in the distance, was the looming industry of the land of the Northwest. It is an image that clearly had an impact on the boy. This is what he saw. Birmingham was a hive of industry, the city of 1,000 trades, including silversmithing, jewels and rings in the jewellery quarter. Whilst it was a mere 5 miles to the oratory and Sarehole Mill, to Tolkien it was another world. He looked out over Dudley, a town of foundries, coal mines, chimneys, soot with the smell of sulphur that gave the area its nickname of the Black Country. Overlooking all of this stood the medieval Dudley Castle. What he saw was the very dark place of Mount Doom, where you could imagine Sauron living in Mordor. The other direction gave him his green and pleasant land of the Shire. So was it a coincidence that his fictional Shire was fully landlocked, as this part of England is? After all, everyone knows most hobbits fear the sea. Dudley today looks now different, and is now more green country than black country. From what Tolkien saw around him, it is noticeably clear that he didn't need to go very far for his mind to create fantastical worlds. If you want to write fantasy, Tolkien is the master. He took everyday things from his day-to-day life and personal experience, and used them as a resource. Tolkien won a scholarship to his local grammar school and was indeed a scholar, and being a lover of language, he invented his own private language of Nefarin, based on Latin and Spanish. He would go on to create many languages as part of his worlds. He was the outsider who used his immense talents to fit in, and was accepted into a circle of friends. Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, who was the headmaster's son, based no doubt on his intelligence and his ability not to be the underdog. There were 4 of them, just as we have 4 adventurous hobbits. Their friendship is based on a love of being creative. You have the poets, the writers, and the musicians, and they cultivated all of this over tea, of all things. They met up at Barrow Stores, a posh Birmingham store founded by the Cadbury's family, who gave the boys their name for the gang, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, or TCBS for short. This group gave Tolkien the opportunity to debate all the things that he loved with his contemporaries, namely myths and language, his own little Council of Elrond. It was around this time that Tolkien met and fell in love with his future wife, Edith, when he was 16. She was older and not Catholic, which didn't go down with his guardian, and he was actually forbidden from seeing her until he came of age and had finished his education. Edith was never far from his mind, and on the eve of his 21st birthday, he declared his love for her and proposed. Before they could wed, war was declared, though Tolkien insisted on finishing his degree before signing up. The month after the war broke out, Tolkien gave us our first glimpse into Middle-earth, as he took his first foray into fantasy world-making, known as the Voyage of Rivendale, the Evening Star. Religion was important to him and his relationship with the priests in the oratory, and he regularly took holidays with the priests to Cornwall, where he first saw the wild Cornish coastline. An early version of The Lord of the Rings, The Lost Road, was set in Cornwall, and the sea features heavily, with the immortal elves fleeing to the Western Sea as an escape from Middle-earth. This is reflected in early Celtic myth, with the mythical lost lands of Lyonesse lying beneath the sea. He used Celtic myths and legends in all of his work, and this opened the door to new ideas. At Oxford he met Joseph Wright, a philologist, studier of language, whose book The Primer of Gothic Language Tolkien was already familiar with, and who later on went to have a major influence on his life and construct of language. Could this man perhaps have been Tolkien's real-life wise Gandalf?
His woods may have built the galleons that saved his ancestors from invasion. And all this, the general and the specific, the national and the personal, all this he knows and feels and summons somehow, however faintly, with the utterance of a single sound. Oak, a Saxon word, cognates in Old Norse as ek. Language is never nonsense. Language is meaning.
The prosperity of the Midlands was to be threatened, with its industry turned from ploughshare to swords in 1914 as a world war erupted, and the 4 young members of the TCBS were thrust into an unexpected adventure. Tolkien graduated in 1915 and signed up to the Lancashire Fusiliers as a second lieutenant. In September of that year, the TCBS met up in Lichfield, which would turn out to be the last time the 4 young men would meet. Before going to war in 1916, John and Edith were married in Warwick, with the blessing of his former guardian, Father Francis. He was shipped over to France 3 weeks before commencement of the Battle of the Somme. To combat his solitude, loneliness and boredom, he wrote as he lived with thousands of other men in little holes dug out of the ground that, for a brief time, were to be their home. He saw action almost at once in a battle that was to take the lives of 2 of his closest friends, Rob Gilson and Geoffrey Smith. His mother had looked to protect him from a life of misery and carnage. The dark landscape of the Black Country was no preparation for what he was to see. Yet here he was, surrounded by the smell of death and dying. Young men, younger than himself, were sent over the top, never to return. Killed beyond recognition. There is no doubt that the war had a profound effect on the world that Tolkien was building in his head. It was no longer green and black, but grey and tinged with death and battle. His time at the front was short, but unlike many, he did survive. In October 1916, he contracted trench fever, a parasitic disease carried by lice, and he returned to England in November. His battalion almost completely gone after his return. Without going to war and seeing its horrors, the world that he gives us may have been entirely different. No one chooses to go to war, but as he wrote of the places and events that were familiar to him before turning them on their head, then it was inevitable that he should write about it. Without his time at the front, would we have had the epic battle scenes described in the books, or the darkness of his fantasy? The war may have shaped him into being a very different type of writer, but despite everything, his imagination and writing during the war aided his mental well-being. The war changed him, and whilst there is some contention around this, he probably suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as shell shock. There is no doubt that he, like many, felt the shame of surviving. 2 of his closest friends were gone. One of the first things he published was a book of poetry, A Spring Harvest by his fellow TCB member Geoffrey Smith in June 1918, the ending of which was sent to Tolkien from the trenches. So we lay down the pen, so we forbear the building of the rhyme, and bid our hearts to steel for times, and a time till ends the strife. And then, when the new age is verily begun, God grants that we may do things undone. Despite everything, Tolkien had remained a quixotic writer in a world that had changed forever. He spent the rest of the war either on home service duties or in hospitals, thanks to continuous resurgence of his illness, with his wife and newborn son, John. One of these hospitals was Brooklands Officers' Hospital in Hull. It is said that whilst here in a delirious state, Tolkien looked out and saw the looming tower that was to be the basis for the Tower of Orthanc, within the Ring of Isengard. In fact, his inspiration for this was the majestic 100-metre-high clock tower of Birmingham University. This is known locally as Old Joe, which gave him the home of Wizard Sauron, which stands in semicircle, and is the tallest freestanding clock tower in the world. He would have seen this tower from his time at the Oratory. Whilst recuperating, the Tolkiens went out in the nearby woods in Ruse, and Edith began to dance for him amongst the hemlock, which clearly had an impact on him and inspired the meeting of Beren and Luthien. In July 1919, Tolkien officially left his post at the military with a temporary disability pension at Fovant on Salisbury Plain. Over the next 12 years, the Tolkiens went to have 3 further children, 2 boys and a girl, who he needed to support. He began his work as a freelance tutor, as well as working in Oxford on the New Oxford Dictionary. Primarily, Tolkien was a devoted family man, and he wanted to provide his family with the security which he did not have in his early years. It was his children who inspired his first forays into storytelling, sending them illustrated letters from Father Christmas, which told of the adventures of the man in the red suit and his elves. Whilst at Oxford, Tolkien began work on The Hobbit, a book for his children, and the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. He never intended to publish The Hobbit, but on lending manuscripts to his friends, it ended up in the hands of a publisher, and The Hobbit was published in September 1937, complete with Tolkien's own illustrations and maps. The Hobbit was a critical success and sold out in 3 months. To this day, it is still a classic. Well, you know that already. Tolkien wrote for himself. Throughout his bleakest times, it provided him with an outlet for his imagination and creativity. His children gave him a captive audience, just like he was to his mother's tales from Beowulf. He later revisited this work and translated Beowulf, although it was not published until after his death when it was edited by his son. He did, however, give an acclaimed lecture on this work, citing against the consensus that the monsters were essential to the poem. He also cited that the poem as amongst my most valued sources. A faculty meeting in May 1926 in Oxford led to the meeting of 2 of the greatest literary minds in fiction, namely Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Together they met up with like-minded individuals, and the Inklings were formed. These were the main critical readers of Tolkien's work, and would have been key players in shaping not just The Lord of the Rings and the works of other writers, with both Lewis and Tolkien citing the importance of it. There's a lot of speculation around Ireland and Tolkien visiting there with C.S. Lewis in the mid-1920s. There's a particular cave called Pon na Gollum in County Clare that possibly provides the inspiration for the name of that little creature who was so enthralled by the One Ring. It is true that Tolkien worked in Ireland in the late 1940s, and the family did holiday there in 1951, but poor old Gollum was already ingrained in our psyche by then. We'll be exploring the histories of Tolkien's characters in more depth in the next chapter. Yes, there will be more to this tale. Horses were an important part of Tolkien's world. We have already established that his love for Beowulf, in which our hero is rewarded for killing Grendel, in Horses and Treasure. Horses were treasure. He loved myth, legend, and old world language, and in this world the horses are the goddess, a symbol of power and status. Luckily for him, on his doorstep in the Oxfordshire countryside was the most prolific horse in the land, Uffington White Horse. This vast and beautiful beast lies on the hillside beneath an Iron Age hill fort and above a dragon. Is it any wonder that to him, this was the land of Rohan, with its horse lords of Rohirrim? Rohan is a rich land of status, and what greater status symbol could he give than the horse? Of course, where there are horses, there is also a need for smiths. He had to look no further than a mile's walk away from the horse to find this at Wayland's smithy, a Neolithic burial chamber, or barrow, which was once home to Wayland, the Saxon god of metalworking. In Beowulf, there is mention of Wayland the smith. Coincidence? I think not, but truly an inspiration to the young writer. Tolkien's services were not needed in the Second World War, and he focused his attention on completing his epic masterpiece, Lord of the Rings, 10 years after his first sketches in 1948. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was first published in 1954 to 1955. And like The Hobbit, it is a darker tale, and meant for an older audience, which isn't to say it doesn't appeal to all ages. You would have had to be, to world build the way he did. The landscapes he created are not small, but neither was the inspiration. Without building on places that were familiar to him, this world would have been a nigh on impossible task. He was clearly enthusiastic about art, drawing, nature and language. Most of his work was published posthumously. One of these was Bilbo's Last Song. This poem came out a year after his death and gave us the epilogue that the world needed to say farewell to this funny little hole-dwelling fellow, who is now part of so many lives. The timing of its publication added poignancy, as Tolkien too said his goodbye in a way that only he could. Farewell to Middle-earth at last. I see the star above your mast. Whilst there is no doubt that Tolkien was a complex man, he was also a man who didn't need to go far to find new worlds, or create new languages. He just saw the world differently. Above all else, Tolkien had passion, and believed every word he wrote, because he was living in these worlds in his head. So, look outside. Look all around you. Look at your friends and the places you know, and let your imagination take them to worlds beyond your wildest dreams. In 100 years' time, someone may be writing about you, but unless you actually dare to dream and believe you can, you'll never know. The wide world is all about you, and you can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out. Like Sam, throw the dust in the air and something beautiful may happen. There's so much more to say about the man, but for now, I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching. Do like, subscribe and comment if you enjoyed this, and please consider becoming a Patreon so we can make more of these videos just for you.